And we're going to be speaking about the COVID inquiry because former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has been given evidence. Let's just pick out some of the highlights. I can see why people felt I was overconfident, he told the inquiry. He blamed largely Dominic Cummings for the toxic culture at Number 10. He said we should have locked down 3 weeks earlier, and he insisted that he had told Boris Johnson that the country should lock down as early as March the 13th, 2020. This is what he said.
I've had the chance to check because you questioned the phone call I made to the Prime Minister. It was at 3:34 that afternoon. I've been at 3:24. I've been able to check my phone records, which have I've come to light since. Hold on.
No, Mr. Hancock. You know perfectly well that we have scoured every possible source for documents and material relevant to the issues in this inquiry. Are you saying that you have a record of a phone call which you've not disclosed to this inquiry?
No, there isn't. There's only a record that the phone call took place.
So you don't know what you said in that phone call?
I do.
All right.
So that rather testy exchange with the lawyer there may raise questions about Matt Hancock's testimony. And my audience question tonight is a quite simple one. Do you believe him? Do you believe what he's been telling the inquiry today? Get in touch with me. You can email farage@gbnews.com or tweet #Farage on GB News. Well, let's bring Professor Carl Hennigan into the conversation. He's the director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford. I know, Carl, that you went in and you did advise Boris Johnson at one stage, but then because you were sceptical about lockdown, you were rather frozen out of the process. I wonder in general what you make of the inquiry. You wrote a piece for The Spectator where you basically asked, what's the point of it? Are you still of that opinion, Professor?
Well, look, I think we always sort of thought about government. It was a bit disorganised and dysfunctional. But this is a window into how it works. And it's at a whole new level of distrust and dysfunctionality. So we're able to see the workings of government that we've never seen before. So I also think what's happening, though, is we're looking at government decision making. And what's happening is everybody's blaming everybody. The advisors are blaming the ministers. The civil servants are blaming everybody. And at this point, I thought what happened here with Hancock is Patrick Vallance had it nailed on the head. He said he has a habit of saying things which he didn't have a basis for. And the key point there was Hugo Keith was saying, hold on a minute, you had a book that said this was the whole truth. This was the pandemic, the raw details of it. And in there, he never mentioned anything about the 13th of March and the immediate lockdown and the call with the Prime Minister. And now all of a sudden he's pulled it out of the bag. So I think actually, how can we trust these people on hearsay? And I have to say, most of the things that Hancock said today, I just found we didn't learn any lessons whatsoever.
Did you find it as interesting as I did, Professor, that in the week questions were asked, I think, by Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, about the origins of the virus, wanted the inquiry to perhaps look into whether it was man-made in China. And he was quickly told, no, sorry, this isn't what the inquiry is dealing with. Well, if it isn't dealing with that very central question, one could argue what the point of it is, actually.
So I think, Camilla, there are two central questions. You're right. If it is man-made, and that's what they considered the issues were, you can understand why they were much more concerned about locking down. If they're suddenly saying, we've got this virus, we've got these research institutes in China that can do gain of function, and they're creating bioweapons, you could understand the panic and the alarm that occurred. I think that's one issue. The second issue that the inquiry has to do is start asking the questions, did lockdowns work? Because amongst people like Hancock, there's a belief that lockdowns work. And therefore, all we need is more lockdown, do it harder and faster next time. And actually, if you start looking at the evidence, that unravels really quickly. But I actually think Hancock's statements today was thrown in to distract everybody and say, I had the opportunity and the answer, and I could have created a massive difference if you'd only listened to me. And that was a distraction technique because he was just pulling a number out of the fresh air as far as I'm concerned.
Carl Hennigan, thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening. Lloyd Morlin joins me now. He's a Conservative peer. He's a former advisor to Boris Johnson, who, of course, is appearing at the inquiry next week. Out of interest, have you spoken to him about his imminent appearance?
I have not.
No. And how do you think he should handle it? Because as Carl Hennigan has just illustrated, It has become a blame game, this. You've got the scientists blaming the government. You've got the government blaming the scientists. No doubt Mr. Johnson is going to be placed in a precarious position for 2 days in the stand when it appears to me as if this inquiry is somewhat of a foregone conclusion. The inquiry is leaning in favour of the idea that we didn't lock down soon enough or hard enough. So how do you think your friend and ally is going to fare?
Well, I don't know. I think that Lady Hallett has lost control of the inquiry, and I think actually it should be wound up.
Really?
I don't think this inquiry is going anywhere. It seems to me the first purpose of Mr. Keith in asking his questions, one old Etonian to another, is basically to ensure that Boris Johnson can never come back into political life. That seems to me what the inquiry is now.
I mean, he'd defend himself. You're saying that he's ideologically motivated to destroy Boris Johnson.
I'm not saying he's ideologically motivated. I'm saying he's only interested in gotcha questions to try and humiliate anyone who appears in front of him.
I mean, he'll be arguing, Lloyd Boylan, that he's there to find answers out about how the government responded to this pandemic.
Yeah, he'll say that's what he'll say, but he isn't actually doing that because he isn't looking at government functionality as a whole. He isn't looking at it from the point of view of a Prime Minister or indeed a Health Secretary, and I have no idea whether Matt Hancock made that phone call or not.
What's your suspicion?
I don't have suspicions, but he isn't answering, looking at it from the point of view of people who are dealing with something where they're getting contrary advice the whole time and want to weigh it up and aren't getting the tools from people to allow them to weigh it up. They're just being shouted at in one ear by one person and the other ear by somebody else, and they've got to make that decision. The other assumption here is that it matters whether Matt Hancock said we should. It doesn't matter. There seem to be people out there who think that if we'd locked down a week earlier than we did, because I think we locked down on the 20th, if we'd, there was an informal lockdown on the 20th, I think, and a week later it became legal. If we'd done it all a week earlier, that somehow nobody would have died. I mean, it's all fantasy.
Yes.
These tiny adjustments, these tiny decisions about whether something should be brought forward by a few days or not was going to have material effect on what happened.
Yes.
I'm sure there were things the government did wrong. Matt Hancock has admitted that this idea that elderly people being moved out of hospitals were going to be safe was wrong. And there was a great deal of cruelty involved in that. And there were, they have victims groups here. Victims groups who represent people who lost families to COVID, lost family members to COVID, but they don't seem to have victims groups of parents whose children's education was disrupted.
Or even people who lost lives because of COVID because they couldn't get treated for other things.
Because they get treated for cancer and for things like that. Those people don't seem to be represented. So the bias is in there. And these are decisions by Lady Hallett. Who gets represented decisions for her.
But we must scrutinise the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, and how he handled this pandemic.
What his advice would be. My advice is he should tell the truth as he saw it from where he was.
How do you think he handled the pandemic?
I think
he was ill during a period at the beginning of it, but you'll be familiar with the kind of Matt Lucas lampooning of, stay indoors, don't stay indoors. It was all very confusing. Did he manage it adequately?
I think once the decision to have a lockdown was made, I think Boris actually led that very well. I think he communicated the government's decision well to the public, and I think that at the early stages he had a lot of respect for doing it. He did fall ill later, but that was a bit later.
Yes.
That was a bit later.
But didn't he squander his sort of libertarian principles on the altar of following the science? And wouldn't he now reflect and think that actually if he'd had more courage to stick to his guns and his instincts were to do a Sweden and not have the lockdowns that we ended up having, he'd have fared a lot better? You wouldn't have had Partygate, would you? I
don't know whether he thinks that now. But I would think that now. I mean, I would have supported, I'd have gone along. I was persuaded by the argument for lockdown early on, just as a member of the public. I don't have any special scientific knowledge to bring to bear on this. But the big question about lockdown from the outset, the people were asking, and Boris was asking, was how do you get out of it?
Yes.
How do you bring the lockdown to an end? And nobody had an answer to that. And that was a question of crucial importance, both for public morale, public health, and public finances and the state of the economy, which we're all still suffering from, loaded with debt as a result, which is inhibiting our economic life loaded with debt even now and for years to come as a result of a decision to go into a lockdown with no clear plan how you come out of it. And the whole test, trace and isolate thing was always going to be a fantasy.
So any inquiry, to conclude, really needs to answer the central question, which this one doesn't seem to: was the cure worse than the disease?
That is absolutely a crucial question. And the other one, just to support Carl Hennigan, if you want to plan for a future pandemic, it's absolutely crucial you know how the pandemic you're looking at started. And they don't seem to be remotely interested.
Lloyd Moylan, thank you very much indeed for joining me in the studio this evening.